Okay, so this is a webinar called Speak Your Truth, and we're going to be talking about how to be effective when talking with legislators and testifying at the State House. I think you both were on the webinar last week, so this is a little bit of a deeper dive into the extra materials that you got from that webinar. So this should be a little addition for you. So the most important thing to remember when you're talking with legislators is that they're people, they're human beings. They need the same things you need. They have the same issues you have. And sometimes it's hard to remember that. So we always like to repeat that a lot because a lot of times you sort of tend to objectify people in power when you're talking to them. And I find that it's really helpful if you can just think about them as human beings. So we're going to go through some top tips for working with legislators, and we'll do a little bit of more info on a few of them, and then a little bit less on some of the other ones. So being helpful is kind of obvious, but whether you're in a state where legislators have staff or like Vermont where they don't have staff, it's really great to establish yourself as a helpful resource for either the legislator or the staff. You can make sure that you develop a reputation of providing useful, accurate information when you're asked for it, that you don't overwhelm them with information, but you give them stuff that they can actually use. And I like to just ask legislators or staff people directly, what do you need from me? What would be helpful to you? A lot of times they'll be very clear and tell you exactly what they need. Call ahead, obviously, if you're going to the State House and you're trying to meet with a legislator or a staff person, you want to let them know you're coming. You may or may not get a call back. For instance, in Vermont, because they don't have staff, a lot of times, they get your message, but they also don't really have any way to make a specific appointment. They don't have offices here. But letting them know, hey, I'm going to be in the building between 10 and 2. I'll be looking for you. That can really help here, where they will look out for you. If you have a lobbyist like me that you work with, you can tell them that too. A lot of times they'll come to me and say, hey, I'm looking for Joe. Can you help me find him? If they do have staff people, sometimes you can have a better chance of making a specific appointment. But again, giving a window, saying you'll be in the building, that gives you more of a chance of actually getting time with the legislator. And being prepared, you really want to do your work before you have your meeting. It's your job to really keep this meeting on track. It's probably going to be a fairly short meeting. Sometimes they're as short as 5 or 10 minutes. Sometimes you're lucky and you get 20 or 30 minutes. But really knowing what you want to say and what you're asking for and being very clear about that can really help to have a satisfying experience for both you and the legislator or the staff person. You want to practice before you go to the meeting. So you want to practice a couple of things. You want to practice saying the things you want to say. You want to practice asking the thing that you want to ask for. And you want to practice staying calm and respectful. So the person you're meeting with may or may not agree with you. They might ask you dumb questions. They might say something alarming. And it's really important for you to have some strategies around sticking with the meeting. Keep yourself calm. Be respectful. Don't argue with the person. Stick to your talking points and be very clear about what your request is, and ask them, will you do what I'm asking or not? So that you can, when you leave the meeting, you have some sense of what your next step is. Next two tips are learn the process and be respectful. seems obvious being respectful, but we like to say it out loud. You know, these are folks who are often overwhelmed and very busy. Again, both staff and legislators can be overwhelmed and very busy. They're probably juggling a lot of balls. They might be a little bit nervous about meeting with you because they might not know a lot about the topic you're meeting about. So really, again, keeping in mind that they're human beings, that they're, you know, kind of have an attitude that they're doing their best in the moment and really trying to bring your best self. Jim, for folks who don't respond to email, I would call them. First of all, try a different form of communication. And also, I would try to talk to them in person if possible. I know you're here in Vermont, so a lot of times just showing up at the State House and catching them in the hall can work. If you're in another state where there are offices, a lot of times just popping into the office and saying, you know, I was here, I've been trying to contact you, you know, can we have a few minutes to talk? That can often work. In terms of learning the process, as I think the both of you know, we have a different webinar on the Vermont legislative process. Most states have a fairly similar process. But really thinking about, especially if you're talking to a legislator about a bill, letting them know where, the first thing they're going to ask is, where is it? Is it in committee? Is it coming to the floor? Am I expected to vote on it sometime soon? Is it in my committee? Is it in somebody else's committee? How does it, they want to know how it relates to them and when they're going to have to make a decision. So if you're talking to them before they have to vote on the bill or before they have to do something, let them know. I'm just letting you know this bill is starting to move. The committee just took it up. It might be a few weeks before it comes to the floor, but we want to make sure that people know what it's about and that we're answering questions for folks, you know, that sort of thing. Obviously, if you talk to them too late, you're not going to be effective. So if you're talking to a House member and the House has already voted on the bill, they're not going to be too interested because they have other things they have to be dealing with, and also it doesn't matter because they already voted. So really thinking about that and talking to them about where the bill is in the process and trying to catch them at the time when they need to focus on it, because being a legislator really means sort of focusing on what is the next thing on the list. And so keeping that in mind, that they're constantly prioritizing. You want to stay on message, which we'll talk about in a minute. You want to also be a human being. So you might, if you live in a state like Vermont or Rhode Island or another small state, you might be bumping into your legislators at other places other than the State House, or you might spend a lot of time in the building and you might see them a lot. It's really nice if you don't always, every time you see them, talk about the same thing, i.e. your issue and your demands. Engage with them as a human being. Talk about your grandkids or their grandkids. Talk about your vacation. Ask them, you know, what kind of books they're reading or if they saw a movie lately, just like you would with other people that you engage with as human beings. I always say, like, you don't want to be that guy. There's always the guy who, no matter where you see him, no matter what the context is, no matter how much time you have, the second he starts talking to you, or she, it could be a lady, it's this issue, this has to happen, things aren't happening, this is the only thing I have to talk about, and I am going to keep talking about this no matter what else you say. And I'll tell you what, I'm not even a legislator. I don't want to talk to that guy. Nobody wants to talk to that guy because we already know what he's going to say. And it's like talking to a robot. It's not a satisfying human experience. So just remember that you want to be a well-rounded person and talk to them about other things. Also, remember to say thank you. Even if they totally disagree with you, thanking them for listening to you, thanking them for learning about the issue, thanking them for considering what you have to say can be really important. If they actually do something that you ask them to do, be sure to thank them, because legislators, staff people never get thanked. It's such an unusual thing. They're always being asked to do things. They're always being blamed for not doing things. They're rarely getting acknowledged for the things they actually do. And they do remember the people who acknowledge what they do and thank them for doing it. So staying on message, when you meet with a legislator or a staff person and you're talking about an issue, they're going to ask you questions that might not be totally related. They're going to say a statistic that they know that may or may not be relevant. They're going to say completely random things. And that's partly because they're trying to engage in the conversation. If they don't know a lot about your issue, just like you would with somebody who's talking about something you don't know a lot about, you might ask a question that's not totally on point, or you might try to show your interest by saying something that you do know that's sort of tangentially related. These are normal things to do. They're not necessarily avoiding the issue or trying to be aggressive. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But as I mentioned earlier, it's your job to keep the meeting on track. And one of the ways to do that is to have some pivot sentences that work for you. These are a few examples. You can use other ones. Sometimes you don't have to say anything. You can just be silent for a second and then go back to your talking points. So for pivots, so what a pivot is a way to transition from whatever the other person said back to what you want to say. So they might have just asked you a question, or they might have just said a statistic or said a random thing, and you want to get the meeting back on track. And so a pivot is a way to do that. And it's usually one or two sentences. Like I said, these are some examples. It's really good to have two or three that feel comfortable for you to say, that you have written down somewhere, and that you practice saying all the time. Because what's usually true about using pivots is it feels awkward to you to say the pivots, but the other person rarely even notices that it has happened. Or if they do, they get over it and realize you're just trying to keep the meeting on track. It's pretty rare for someone to acknowledge anything weird about somebody else using a pivot. So it feels weird to you, which is why it's important to practice. And you can practice a couple of different ways. One way is just to say them out loud on your own, by yourself, just the sentences. So for instance, you might just practice saying, I see your point. The way I look at it is this way, blah, 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 whatever your talking points are. Just say it a lot in the shower while you're driving. The other way to practice is to do a role play situation where you ask the other person to try to get you off track, and you're practicing using your pivots and getting back on track with your talking points. This is a tool that you can use in so many different places. I use pivots every day, and it's good to practice them regardless of whether you're meeting with a legislator or not. So it won't be wasted time. So when you're talking to a legislator, policymaker, a staff person, they're going to be really interested in, why are you talking to me about this? So, when I, as a lobbyist, talk to a legislator or a staff person about an issue, the first thing they say to me is, who's your client and why do they care about this issue? But if you're talking to them as an individual advocate or as a representative of an organization that cares about an issue, they're going to want to know why you, what is the thing about this issue that's important to you. And that might be a very personal reason. It might be part of your organization's mission. It might be something that your members have highlighted as a policy issue. Whatever it is, get really clear on what is your story and why are you working on this issue. It shouldn't be a 2-hour story. It should be a few sentences that you can summarize, an elevator kind of thing. And it's really important for you to know what it is that you want as opposed to only what you don't want. So a lot of times when people come to policymakers, their whole thing is, this is the problem. The problem is this. This is a real problem for a lot of people. But they don't have any suggestions about a solution. And you might not know exactly how to fix the problem, but you should know what is the end state that you're trying to get to and have a few suggestions for things that could happen. It's always better if you do know exactly how to fix it, but you might not have the capacity or resources to do that. But you might say, well, these are the things that need to be looked at, and this is the way, the end state that we want. And so that can help the policymaker figure out how to help you get what you're after. And when you talk to a legislator, you don't have to know every answer to every question. You know what's true for you, and as long as you're telling the truth and you're not making things up and you're not pretending to remember things that you don't really remember, you'll be fine. As I just said, you don't have to know everything. But it is good to understand, as I mentioned earlier, the process that they're in. And also, the legislative process that they're in, but also ask the person, or ask people who know the person, how does this person make decisions? What kinds of information are helpful to this person to make decisions? Do they have a background that's relevant to this issue? Usually you can find a short biography of legislators, either on the legislative website or on their campaign website. You can look and see, has this person worked anywhere or been on a board somewhere that is relevant to the issue, and it might help you to ask them about that. And also thinking about their own decision-making process. Some people do want data and statistics, and some people, that's less important to them. And what's more important is really understanding process things. Or sometimes it's more important to them to actually talk to a person who's affected by the decision they're about to make. And if they ask you something you don't know the answer to, it's fine to just say, you know what, I don't know the answer to that. I'll try to find out and I'll follow up with you. Make sure you do follow up. Even if you can't get the answer, let them know that. I've tried, this is where I looked, I couldn't find the answer. You might suggest somebody else they could talk to if you know who that might be. Okay, so testifying. Again, sorry, Jim, your question is, are there different rules? Sorry, I have to read what you wrote. Are there different rules for communicating with leadership versus regular legislators? I don't know about rules in terms of the tips I'm giving. It's usually a little bit harder to talk to leadership, and you want to think about, again, the process. So different states, different strategies, but generally speaking, the leadership is setting the agenda, and they are usually pretty important people in deciding whether something is going to come to the floor or not. So it's nice to check in with them if you're going to have a controversial issue at, before the controversy starts. If you have supporters in the committee, you can let them know that. It's not usually the best timing to go to the leadership when everything's falling apart and expect them to fix it. So thinking about all the different steps in the process and when and where it's the right time to talk to leadership. And we have some of that information in our webinar about legislative strategy as well. But in terms of engaging with them, same rules. They're humans just like you. Their staff people are humans. They're very busy. They want useful, relevant information. Okay, so when you're testifying, you want to know what the process is. So there's a couple of different ways you might testify. You might be testifying in a committee hearing, so the bill might be considered in the committee and you might be asked to come in as a witness. That's mostly what I'm going to focus on right now. But the other way you might be testifying is at a public hearing. And I'm just going to say a few things about a public hearing, because generally speaking, what I'm going to say for testifying in a committee hearing is also true at a public hearing. But one of the differences is, a couple of differences is, at a public hearing, you usually have to go and put your name on a list. Usually anybody who shows up can speak if they sign up on the list. A lot of times they'll take turns, people in opposition, people in support. So sometimes you have to say when you sign up whether you're supporting whatever they're proposing or opposing it. You're usually given a very specific time limit at a public hearing, and there's a timer and you have to stop when your time is up. It's often 2 minutes, sometimes it's 3 or 4 minutes. You can always submit written testimony that is longer or the same as what you're speaking. And in a public hearing, usually the rule is that they do not engage with you. So you sit down and give your testimony. They're not supposed to ask you questions. They're not supposed to answer your questions. And so just knowing that at a public hearing, it's different. In a committee hearing, they are likely to engage with you. So that's one pretty big difference between a regular committee hearing and a public hearing. So again, this next part is focused on a committee hearing. So first of all, know where they are in the process and what questions they're asking. I'm going to show you something in a second, another website. You want to be really clear about what you want and what your request is. So if they're working on a bill and you have suggestions for how to make the bill better, be as specific and clear as possible. Have a copy of the bill, show them, I want you to change this sentence. Here's my suggestion for how to change it, and give them a reason why. I like to say your request first and then the reason. A lot of times people spend a lot of time on explaining why they're asking for what they want, and then they say what they want, and everybody's confused because they don't know what the person's talking about until the end of their testimony, and that is not effective. So make your request and then say why. And also, when you go to a committee hearing, you really have to be prepared for anything. You might get delayed. Somebody might not show up. You might suddenly have more time than you thought. If they are delayed, you might suddenly have a lot less time than you thought. They might ask you questions. They might not ask you questions. Like, all kinds of things can happen in a committee hearing. And again, being prepared, having practice staying calm, really having some pivots that you're comfortable with, and also really practicing if somebody asks you something that you really don't know the answer to, or that you think is an aggressive question, really practicing not being defensive and just having a standard answer like, I don't know the answer to that. I'll try to find out and follow up with you later. If you are given a set amount of time and you're going to talk longer, you might want to also submit written testimony that is a little bit longer or different supplemental materials, you can send that in usually ahead of time. So I'm just going to show you, this is the Vermont Legislative website. If you go to any committee page on here, like let's say you're going to testify in the House General Committee, you can go to their website and, there's nothing scheduled right now, so because we're not in session, but you can see on days when they had testimony, these are the types of things that people submitted as testimony. And you'll see some of these things are drafts of bills or amendments. So sometimes in a committee will have you come in and they'll say, we're working on draft 2.1 of the bill or draft 2.1 of the amendment. And you can actually go to the website and look at it. And so that you're speaking from the document that they're also looking at. You might have the one from the day before, because one of the things that happens sometimes is you come in to give your testimony and all of a sudden they have a new draft that you didn't know was happening. But you can say, the draft I'm speaking from is draft 2.1, and usually at the top of a draft like that, they'll have some reference numbers like this, where the time and date stamp is on there. So you can refer to it so the committee knows if they're looking at a different draft, they can say, oh, the place you're talking about has changed, and then you can look at that new part. So just being really clear about that. And you can also go back and read if they've been having hearings on the bill or the issue, you can go in there and look at the different days and read the testimony that's already been submitted. You'll usually only see the written testimony. In Vermont, you can request the audio recordings of hearings as well, and you can get an MP3 file to listen to before you go in if you want to. It usually takes a little bit of time to do that, so sometimes you don't have time. And other states have different opportunities. Also, a lot of times if it's a controversial issue, the public access TV will be recording hearings, and you can check on their websites to see if they have recorded versions of the video recordings of the hearings that you can watch. So again, just getting ready for the testimony. Again, you really want to think about keeping yourself well grounded. And also, a lot of times people start talking before they're even sitting in the chair, and that's really weird. It makes the whole room feel awkward. So I always tell people, get yourself in the chair, get yourself organized, have your notes in front of you, look up at the legislators, smile at them, and say, hey, thanks for the opportunity to come in and testify today, and then start giving your testimony. Don't start talking as you're walking up. Don't jump right into, on page 46, da 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 da. Greet them. They're humans. You're a human. Act like humans. It's really nice to tell a story. It has to be relevant to the issue, and it should somehow illustrate the need for the request that you're making. Also, it should be brief. Don't tell a 2-hour story. Tell a 2-minute or less story. If you're telling a story about someone else, make sure that you're clear about the credibility, the validity, and that you have permission to share the story. I've already talked about making a specific request. I can't say that enough. I sit through a lot of committee hearings in the State House, and mostly the testimony is people complaining about how bad things are, how bad the bill is, all the problems, all the things the legislators haven't thought of. But very few people actually say, here's a suggestion for how to make it better. And people, the legislators really pay attention when they hear that, because it's, first of all, because it's rare, and second of all, because they want to make the bill better. So they might not agree with the suggestion, but they're going to listen to it and they're going to think about it. And I've said this a lot, I will say it again, practice. Practice before you go. Even if all you have time to do is read your testimony out loud once before you get in there, it'll make a big difference for you. So I really recommend doing it. And the number one thing to remember is legislators are people, and you want to treat them like people, and you want to really interact with them the way you would interact with other human beings. So that's, we're going to end a little early today because this is a fairly short one, but I'm happy to answer any questions that either of you have.